Fellow audience members, the use of cameras and recording devices is strictly prohibited. Before we begin, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge that the University of Massachusetts Amherst was founded and built on the unceded homelands of the Po-Cum-Tuck Nation on the land of the Norwottuck community. We begin with gratitude for nearby waters and lands. We recognize these lands and waters as important relations with which we are all interconnected and depend on to sustain life and well-being. The Po-Cum-Tuck had connections with these lands for millennia. Over 400 years of colonization. When Po-Cum-Tuck peoples were displaced, many joined their Algonquian relatives to the east, south, west, and north. That includes Mashpee and Aquinnah Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Narragansett, Mohegan, Pequot, and Mohican communities, and Abenaki and other nations of the Wabanaki Confederacy. These native peoples still maintain connections and relationships of care for these lands today. We also acknowledge that the University of Massachusetts Amherst is a land-grant university. As part of the Morrill Land Grant Act, portions of land from 84 native nations west of the Mississippi were sold to provide the resources to found and build this university. As an active first step towards decolonization, we encourage you to learn more about the native nations whose homelands UMass Amherst now resides on, and the indigenous homelands on which you live and work. We also invite you to deepen your relationship to these living lands and waters. Thank you, and enjoy the program.
Hi, everyone. We encourage you to move forward if you're comfortable. This is kind of like a family reunion. I think I know half of you here, so welcome. Thank you for coming out this evening on this cold spring night. Again, I'm Kurt Griffin. I'm one of the co-directors of our School of Earth and Sustainability. Sitting back here in the dark is my other co-director and colleague and friend, Rob DeCanto. So we're here, we're one of the convening partners for the Art, Sustainability, and Activism series. And this is the third series that we've done, working with the UMass Fine Arts Center and also the MFA for Poets and Writers program. Our program seeks to create deliberate opportunities to connect artists, scientists, and changemakers, recognizing that we learn from each other. Together we reckon with climate change, elevating awareness, recognizing climate grief, and catalyzing meaningful change. A special shout out to Hillary Rathman and Michael Sakamoto from the Fine Arts Center, Noy Holland and Jennifer Jacobson from the MFA Poets and Writers program, and one of my favorites, Darcy Maresca from our School of Earth and Sustainability. This evening's event would not be possible without all these folks and several others. You know, as a scientist, I've seen many remarkable scientific discoveries over my career, but discovery and knowledge alone does not guarantee change. As we face the complex challenges before us, in terms of solving our global environmental challenges, especially with regard to climate crisis and also environmental and social justice, oftentimes scientific data are simply not enough to change people's behaviors. Yet working with artists and writers and activists and community leaders, we can change the hearts and minds of people. Our art, sustainability, activism, collaboration is a step towards that ideal. So we're so thankful for our partnership in this series, and we're excited to see where our collaboration goes next. We also would like to gratefully acknowledge our sponsors for this evening's event: the Massachusetts Cultural Center, the Daily Hampshire Gazette, Applewood and Loomis Village, WEIB 106.3 Smooth FM, Hotel UMass, UMass Auxiliary Enterprises, and the Eric Carle Museum of Picture Book Art. Please join me in thanking these wonderful sponsors that we have. So tonight's panel includes artists and producers from small island Big Song who shared a remarkable performance with us yesterday afternoon. If you missed it, you missed something really special. We also have a renowned Native American poet and scholar, a world-leading marine scientist, and ocean conservationist. Hearing from any one of them would be a real treat, but having them all together is a very special opportunity for us to hear. So I'm excited to hear where the panel goes in their conversation. Next, I would like to welcome our event moderator, Noy Holland. For those who haven't had the pleasure to work with Noy, she's a warrior and a tireless advocate for our planet. Noy is the 2018 recipient of the Catherine Ann Porter Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She's the author of the novel Bird and also 4 collections of short fiction, including The Spectacle of the Body, What Begins with Bird, Swim for the Little One First, and I was trying to describe what it feels like, new and selected stories. Noy has been a professor in the MFA for Poets and Writers program here at UMass since 1997, and she serves as the faculty advisor for the Paper Bark magazine. And if you haven't had a chance to get the new edition of Paper Bark, I think you can purchase it out front in the lobby. So what makes Noy the ideal person to moderate tonight's discussion is her career-long leadership and championing art, sustainability, and activism. She asks the big questions, isn't afraid to push groups to new perspectives, and always challenges us to do more. So without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome my friend and colleague, Noy Holland, as our panel moderator for this evening.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. It looks like there are thousands of people out there. It's great. Paperbark is indeed for sale in the lobby there, and I am the faculty advisor. I appreciate all the nice things Kurt said about me. If I can ask the panelists to come on out, that would be great, so you can sit down and not stand backstage in the shadows. Everybody. Yeah. Thank you. So I have a little bit of a lengthy introduction to why I'm up here, or why I think I'm here. It's very opinionated. Westerners have a way of talking about climate, nature, the environment as though it is over there, something apart, something other. But we are nature, and nature is us, and we are making a mess of ourselves and everything that lives. Nature is storm, surge, and dengue, beetle kill, and Lyme. It is hurricane, flood, wildfire. Half of the planet's invertebrates are gone. More than half of the planet's coral reefs are gone. All but 5% of the predators in the ocean are gone. I'm a fiction writer, but this is no fiction. It is not speculation and not entertainment, and it is not off in the future. This is March 2022. The Arctic is 40 degrees too warm. The Russian army, financed by fossil fuel revenue, occupies Ukraine, bombing apartment complexes, hospitals, nuclear plants. People are being evacuated for springtime fires in Colorado. Pipelines leak and Enbridge pushes to build more of them across sacred native lands. Line 3, Line 5, Dakota Access, tar sands, crude, fracked gas. The Atlantic washed not long ago through the homes and streets of Scituate, through the streets of Far Rockaway, across the sidewalks of Miami. The Gulf Stream slows, the jet stream falters. What do we do in the face of what we know about the past, the present, and the future? The missed opportunities, the opportunities to come. The suffering that is past, the suffering to come. According to a recent article by Bill McKibben in The New Yorker, we have 95% of the technology we need to answer America's needs for power with 100% renewables by 2035. Slow down, our global leaders say, and we have to say, move. 2035 may be too late for the Marshall Islands, which stand 3 meters above sea level, home to some 60,000 people, and to the radioactive debris of thousands of bombs tested by the U.S. military in the years following World War II. Marshall Islands are not alone among island nations facing the imminent and present peril of the sea level rise. We are all, after all, islands. No nation, no individual is exempt or immune. Kiribati and Boston, Mumbai, Tuvalu, Washington, and Wall Street, no one is exempt or immune. It is folly to think otherwise. 95% of the technology we need for 100% dependency on renewables. That's hopeful. Varshini Prakash and Greta Thunberg make us hopeful. Sunrise, Extinction Rebellion, Ultraviolet, Friends of the Earth, Honor the Earth, Mothers Out Front, Climate Action Network. There are hundreds of organizations and thousands of people fighting the destruction of our collective future. Tim Cole and Bao Chen read the IPCC report, quit their jobs, left Australia, and began the long journey of gathering stills and video footage, recruiting performers and booking shows like the one we saw yesterday, A Smile Island Big Song, at the Fine Arts Center. The message is, wake up, fight on. It's inspiring. But surely we don't think that the fight ought to fall all to them, or to people like them, who are watching their lifetimes being chewed up by indifference and failed climate leadership. We are in this together. No immunity, no exemption. I appreciate at the performance yesterday you're grappling with what it means to be mothers and fathers in 2022. 34 years after NASA scientist James Hansen delivered the news of carbon emissions to the US Congress. To exceed 350 parts per million of carbon was to court disaster. We are over 400 parts per million now, and that number is still rising. To be sure, fear for my children animates me. My children are Benjamin and Phoebe, Harvey, Maria, Dorian, Katrina, Kenneth, and Idai, Dixie, Bootleg, August Complex, Caldor, Lion's Head, Beachy Creek, Holiday Farm, Hayman. These are our children too. We're all complicit. 400 million acres of Siberian taiga on fire, the Amazon on fire, koala bears wearing burn mittens on the scorched continent of Australia, while the Prime Minister vacations in Hawaii and the coal industry wrings its hands because the smoke slows down production. Video footage that ran as part of your performance yesterday showed the devastating bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef. At 1.5 degrees of global warming, the goal of the Paris Climate Accord of 2015, an estimated 90% of the world's coral reefs will die. Current trajectories, worst case scenarios for CO2 emissions predict we'll reach 4 degrees of warming as early as 2061. My daughter will be my age in 2061. By the time I finish talking, another handful of species will be finished for good. In this massive extinction event that is our daily lives, we lose, according to writer and botanist Robin Wall Kimmerer, 200 species every day. Where is the mother in us? Where is the dutiful son? Things change because of people like us. We know the news. When was the last time any of us turned the radio on without being reminded of the effects of climate change? Our investments matter, our votes, the choices we make as consumers, the choices we make as artists and researchers and teachers, our bodies on the line. Don't be tired. Don't be quiet. We do what we do in the next 20 years will shape the human future. People on this stage and many of you in the audience have devoted yourselves to the fight for a livable future. You don't need my sermon. Please hear this then as gratitude and solidarity, as an echo of your call for collective action, a sea change in the mind, a covenant of reciprocity. We have a little more than an hour to discuss these matters with our guests and with our live and virtual audience. This event is being live streamed for audiences around the world. We welcome questions from all of you and from our YouTube audience on the Fine Arts Center channel. This event is being recorded for future access. I want to turn now to welcome our participants. Andy, Kimberly, Selena, Bao, Tim, I'm glad you're all here. I'll start with Kimberly Blazer. Kimberly is a poet, photographer, and scholar. Wisconsin's former poet laureate, Kimberly, is the founding director of INAPO, Indigenous Nations Poets. The author of 5 poetry collections, including Copper Yearning, Apprentice to Justice, and the bilingual Résister en dansant, Equanimity, Dancing Resistance. Blazer is a Anishinaabe activist and environmentalist and enrolled member of the White Earth Nation, a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and an MFA faculty member at the Institute of American Arts in Santa Fe. Bao Chen. Bao is a Smile Island's Big Song manager and project producer. Having negotiated, booked, planned, and tour managed several successful international concert tours across Europe, the USA, Asia, and Oceania, involving up to 13 artists from 8 countries, whilst releasing a music album, creating an interactive website, and bringing a feature film to screen, Bao is one of Taiwan's most prominent producers of cross-cultural arts projects. Bao has realized the Smile Islands Big Song project from the grassroots up, fundraising through crowdfunding, philanthropic bodies, and arts grants, along with initiating the project's fair trade music structure and recognition of intangible cultural heritage. A vivid storyteller, fluent in English and Mandarin, Bao has a social media following of 150,000 people and more, and has been invited to present at TED Talks, APAP NYC, WOMAX, World Stage Design, and numerous film and music festivals. Tim Cole is a Smile Islands Big Song director, music producer, and VJ, is an Australian creative who has worked on cross-cultural arts projects with music at the heart since producing Not Drowning Waving's album and the DVD Tabaran in Papua New Guinea. Developing skills whilst filmmaking at Melbourne University during the day and producing music at night led to a career of equal parts film and music. His reputation in Indigenous arts led him to Alice Springs, a senior music producer for the Central Australian Aboriginal Media Association. Tim holds a BEd in Media Arts from Melbourne University, an AD in Music Production from the University of Victoria in Australia, and has received a Churchill Fellowship and an invitation to speak on climate change and arts at the United Nations. APAP, NYC, WOMAX, and along with other industry recognition through numerous awards for projects he has played a key creative role on. Andy Danilchuk is a fisheries scientist and a professor of ocean conservation. Throughout his life, Andy has been on a personal crusade to ensure that fish are around for future generations to enjoy, whether on the end of a fishing line, on a dinner plate, or simply to watch in wonder. His work spans both marine and freshwater systems and broadly examines how fish respond to natural and anthropogenic disturbances. Much of Andy's current research focuses on evaluating the potential impacts of recreational angling on fish populations and working with user groups to develop best practices for catch and release, including for fish species in the Indo-Pacific. Andy is an award-winning educator, spokesperson, and advocate for positively affecting change when it comes to fish and the complex social ecological systems they are nested in. Selena Lem is a friend of my sister's. Selena Lim is a spoken word and climate activist from the Marshall Islands. Selena is among the global faces of climate change, representing her country in the film Before the Flood, produced by Leonardo DiCaprio, and as the youngest speaker at the COP21 for Paris Agreement, making a passionate plea to global leaders for stronger action on climate change. Selena can push her audience into a place of understanding and care for her homeland, whilst making them look into the future and see the repercussions of current global actions. Her spoken word pieces have been heard across the globe and form the narrative of the Small Islands Big Song show. I'm sorry to say that fiction writer Ellie O'Leary cannot be with us tonight, but I want to note that Ellie conducted an interview with climate scientist Robert DeConto and artist Sandy Litchfield in the current issue of Paperbark, which I hope you'll buy on your way out. Without going on much further, I want to just start by my first question to the panel, which is my briefest question. And if I could ask you, Baba, to begin by answering this question, which is very simply, what do you think are the essential lessons to be learned from our beyond human teachers?
Thank you, Noy, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for being here. I actually grew up in the organic farm because my father is an organic farmer, and I think that has shaped a lot in who I am now and in my my personality. When Tim and I, in 2019, after finishing Small Island Big Song documentary, we were invited back to Vanuatu, who is one of the island nations that we filmed the film and recorded the music. I still remember the day we went back to the village, and Chief Cecil took us to his kitchen and pointed out on the floor, and said, "Look at this. It's a box of rooted yam that the whole village didn't get to plant because a certain flower didn't flower that spring." And that really made me think about my father and how nature speak just through daily life, and how like now in this climate changing environment, we need to adapt to more traditional knowledge and traditional practice. And I still remember he took us to a place called the food bank in the wild, in the mountain. That's where thousands of years their ancestors have been planting wild root vegetables in their garden. And he said, in the past, we can just go there maybe once a year when the cyclone comes, but now we have to go more and more often because of the shortage of food and the changing planting cycle. Yeah, so this is one of the experience we had throughout the 3 years filming trip across the islands, and there's many more effect of climate change we've seen on the islands. And me being here, it makes me feel hopeful, because I think it's important to share stories, and stories only live when it's shared. Yeah.
Yeah, that's for sure. And so I do think that there are stories that are told. We tell humans, we tell each other, and the stories of other creatures, and plants being among the things which also have a lot to tell us. Does anyone else want to jump in on that question? Oh, everybody's got a microphone.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure that I heard everything that you asked, but I think you're asking about how do we understand the wisdom we receive from more than human creatures? Yes. So I was thinking about the way that Indigenous communities actually enact this in their clan systems. So you recognize that this is not all like a common wisdom, but different species and creatures embody certain kinds of wisdom. And so they become models for certain teachings or for certain kinds of understandings in our relationship with the world. And then that relationship, that understanding of their wisdom is formalized in a recognition of them as being a clan animal. And then as we are a member of a clan, it is our duty to recognize what that species or creature or can teach us. And so I think that perhaps the biggest thing that I see that maybe needs to change is the sort of position, the believing that humans are somehow superior to other creatures. And once we just sort of flip that idea and understand that we have much to learn and we are open to it, and then also not to think of all of the more than human as a conglomerate, but to recognize the individual importance of different creatures. And so that also highlights for us why we can't afford to lose any species, because they all have something important that they contribute, and that we will be at a loss to, we can't replace this. We can't replace the knowledge, we can't replace the job they do in the world. So those are just some of the thoughts that I have around that.
Great. Others, yeah.
I kind of want to second that in thinking about the way that we visualize nature and whether we're a part of it or we're at odds with it. And often we think about the ways that we perceive change. And in terms of human societies, we tend to be, growing a bit more impatient. And we see that from generation to generation. And I think in terms of we've kind of lost the ability to see very delicate changes in our environment, the canaries in the coal mine, the things that maybe, indigenous communities and people that have been spending more time on the land, on the sea, for their livelihoods are very much aware of. And I remember when I've been fortunate to live on some small islands, and we all had our devices where we could watch the weather and think about hurricane season and predictions. And I remember being in the local community where there were some elders saying, "Oh, did you notice the mango trees this year? The mango trees are full, quite full. It's going to be a bad hurricane season." And so I remember that being drawn to my attention and thinking about that connection to the environment and how that is the harbinger of bigger things that are changing. And the same would happen with the fish in the sea and how migrations would be changing based on overfishing. And I think that's sort of why I gravitate towards fish. I mean, I love everything related to nature and birds and mammals, but I find fish being that, because they're ectotherms, their body is very tightly tied to the ambient temperatures. And what we've been seeing, and even what local communities have been seeing in small island developing states, is that those fish populations aren't able to adapt at the same rate as the rate that our climate is changing. And the weight of evidence, those observations were made decades ago in the communities, but we were waiting until the scientific evidence came in to show that we are in a climate crisis. And so I think that where I think our place is to think about how we work with broader communities outside of those regions that are in dire threat in the coastal communities to have an awakening that, that what's happening on the coastlines is tied to the weight of humanity and some of the things that we've been ignoring or haven't been aware of, and that at some point it's going to catch up to everybody, not just the coastal communities. And I think that we need to accelerate that awareness as part of this global understanding. And I was really quite taken by the performance yesterday and thinking about how elevating that awareness for small island developing states and coastal communities was wonderful. And it's also sad because at the same time, it wasn't, the effects of climate change and sea level rise are happening in Miami and Boston, but it wasn't until, in Miami when you have a king tide and all of a sudden the sea was coming up through the stormwater sewers that people are starting to realize, oh, climate change is affecting me too. And it's not until, and I think that's a downside of humanity in some ways, until it's not affecting you in your own backyard, that it's not a crisis. And I think we need to pivot and to make sure that we find ways, whether it's through performance and art and other ways to get to people, to elevate the fact that we need a revolution, not just awareness. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, and that sense that the arts can bring that empathic, that imaginative act, which is empathy, whether it affects you or not, and you can translate that to other species and to other humans. Selena, did you want to speak to this?
Yes, before I get to the question, I just wanted to add, in being an advocate for the island nations, I would ask, instead of using small island developing states, please use large ocean nations, as that itself is also, the language that we use can also shift and influence the way people think of us, and we're trying to come from a place of resilience and strength. So putting it to small island, that itself can can I say demonetize? Is that a word? Minimize the strength that we are coming from. And to answer the question, one of the ways I'm humbled always by the strength that nature has, and one of the ways that has helped me is in dealing with the stages of grief. And as someone from the front line, grief is something I'm always seeing the impacts that the climate crisis has in my country, and whenever I talk about some of the impact, I talk about the inundations coming in. These are sea waters rising and flooding our islands, and the next day you see all the vegetation's dying. The little fresh water that we have becomes becomes salinated. I'm so sorry. Becomes salinated. And so, but then few days or weeks after that, I see nature bounce back again. And to me, that is a symbol of like, oh, they've had their moment of grief. They've accepted it. They might have denied it in some way, and now they've accepted it, and now they're saying, okay, we've grieved together, let's now recover together, let's now reclaim back our livelihood and our survivalhood, because that is how we have always been. And even with the changes that does happen, they're so resilient, and they're always finding different ways to recover and adapt. And so now I look at my people and the way we've been grieving for the years that we've been living through this crisis, and I see, oh, we are nature itself. We've adapted the way they have. We've gone past our stages of grief and denying it. We've now accepted it, and now we're working towards reclaiming everything and wanting the justice that our people deserve. Yeah.
I love that. I love using the plants as a kind of model for resilience and resistance, or understanding them that way. Yeah. If you feel pressed to move into this question, I can also move on to the, because it seems to tie in well to something you said, Andy, and also Selena, about the difference sometimes between scientific knowledge and traditional knowledge, the tension that can happen between traditional knowledge and local ecological practice and science, right? So this is a longer question, a two-part question, and I wonder if you can share with us your sense of how these tensions might evolve to deepen our knowledge and light a path backward or forward. And I do say backward and forward very deliberately because I sense that you all might share a little disquiet with the word forward. And I'm thinking of the companion words that forward elicits: efficiency, innovation, progress, being best, arriving first. And is it possible, I wonder, if our most promising future is behind us, that rather than advancing toward more sophisticated technologies, we need to return to a time in which our interdependence, our belonging to the natural riches of the planet, was part of our daily lived awareness. So 2 parts, that sense of tension between local ecological knowledge, traditional knowledge, and science, and then this question about time, really, and the value of forwardness or backwardness, which has been vilified in some way. How does that sound to anybody? Do you want to start us off, Kimberly?
Sure, I can think about that a little bit. So when I think about the idea of the tension between science and traditional indigenous knowledge, I have that same concern about, I think, the failure to sometimes respect traditional indigenous knowledge. So, for example, to make it practical, I am a contributor to a volume that's going to come out about, tribal wildlife practices. And one of the things that I was thinking about recently in the state of Wisconsin, well, first of all, there was the delisting of the wolf from the Endangered Species Act. And then in the state of Wisconsin, where I now live, a hunting season was opened at an inappropriate time when the wolves were pregnant with their young. And it was a slaughter. And some of the tribes are trying to, well, my tribe in Minnesota, the White Earth Nation, actually made White Earth a sanctuary, a wolf sanctuary. But some of the tribes are also trying to establish their own policies and to pass on understandings. So, for example, one of the Anishinaabe tribes in Wisconsin wrote a policy statement in which they acknowledged, for example, that in the way that we have worked traditionally, the wolf is a relative. And there's this wonderful statement where they say, you don't manage a relative, you build a relationship, right? So that's just a really fundamental, different way of approaching our relationships and our reciprocity with the world around us and other creatures. So that's just one thing about that. And the second half of that question was, the forward. Okay. So similarly, I think that part of that whole idea of progress, forward, a superior knowledge, et cetera, is just false. It's just false. Because, again, if you think about traditional communities and the knowledge they already had, where, for example, of planetary bodies, right, where they could build a structure and they could create a small hole through which the sun would shine at one particular moment during the year and would land on a beautiful work of art on the ground and would hit a spot. And how did they know that? Was it because they were backward? No. Okay. So I think that, and again, it's this idea of progression or advancement. It's a fallacy. It's a fallacy at its base. And if we can get away from that and recognize the possibility that other nations, other people, that there's a diversity of knowledge, and the best way to, exist in the world is to share that, I think that's like the first step that we have to take.
Yeah. Tim, you haven't had a chance to throw your voice out there. So you want to follow that?
Yeah, Yeah, look, wow, the conversation, wow, your introduction, that was just so moving. And that's the motivation, that's that place we're in, reading the news. I mean, they're just facts. You put us right there in the reality of where we are now in climate emergency, but it's far greater than that. It's the ecological collapse of our whole planet from many different directions. The chemicals through the system, the plastic pollution through the water, you know, how do we respond to that? And this was where Babao and I were when we heard the IPCC report in the desert. And one way we looked at, and this does tie into those questions about nature and about, you know, other perspectives, Indigenous sort of knowledge, and, you know, with the agency that we could bring to this issue, the two of us, you know, what were the resources, the personal resources we had, and I'd been working on cross-cultural projects across the Pacific and in Aboriginal Australia for, you know, 3 decades by that time, so I had contacts and networks and skills, and Babao was amazing, like to actually get things together and moving, and so I really wanted to try to give voice to nature and to give voice to these different perspectives of seeing our relationship to nature that perhaps we can't express or think in the structures that we have, you know, our language. There are limitations to doing that. Some of the knowledge we're talking about is actually ineffable, you know, but it's embodied, you know, and it's embodied in cultures that have maintained relationships with the place over countless generations, you know. It's embodied in language, in words. It's embodied in stories that may not be literal. I learnt that through working with the Indigenous people of Australia, the songlines that have maintained communities and fragile environments for countless, you know, for thousands, 40,000 years. You know, there's knowledge embodied there, like a technology that passes down how to maintain communities, how to travel across the land, the borders, you know, of your. So our idea was to go and work with people that carry that voice, that maintain the language, that keep the instruments alive, and to record with them on their custodial land and in nature, the very nature that has shaped those instruments and those languages, and to say to them, this is what our project's about. It's to give voice to the land. You choose where to take us to record. You choose what song to sing. Our only rule was in the language of this land and in the instruments of this, because they speak about that relationship. And then we took that song to meet another person on their island with their language and their heritage, and they listened to that song and they improvised to it, the voice of their land to that song. And we spent 3 years doing that to 16 island nations and about 40 different or so Indigenous nations. And by doing that, we were hoping to give voice to, you know, embody that ineffable knowledge in the medium of the artwork itself, you know, and actually, you know, surprise ourselves, because we are not the carriers of that knowledge, but we were the carriers of the microphones and the cameras. Yeah.
Yeah, and the origin is the land. The instrument is a kind of language that comes from the land, that instructs the people who we're still a pretty new species on the planet, right? A lot of other animals and plants have been around a lot longer than we have. So it's that sense of translation across time and moving through tradition. Yeah. And did you seem like you had something to say about this particular question?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it comes to mind when I, you know, as a scientist, and as scientists are trained to, hopefully trained, to think about the objective collection of data and information, and to maintain objectivity. And I think I'm sort of going through this personal transition where, as we see, species disappear and cultures disappear, that I'm becoming more convinced that in addition to, there has to be a better partnership between the scientists that are doing the climate research, and also those climate scientists also have to become activists. That you can still have your science be objective, but you're also a human on the planet, and the planet's in crisis. And so by being able to collectively think about our position on the planet, and it's unfortunate that I find, and I spent a lot of time thinking about the people that create policies, and how unfortunately sometimes they're stuck on numbers, right? And I would want to see greater things to be catalyzed much more quickly, if we can even translate some of observations into into ways that the policymakers can really understand. I'm trying not to be pessimistic, but I also we often need to speak in a language to the people that we're speak in the language to the people that we're trying to convince, right? And sometimes I worry that by not having enough of the climate scientists and the people that are working in natural systems that are seeing themselves as part of this unified force that could come together and have that collective voice that can positively affect change when it comes to whether it's climate change or plastics in the ocean or all these other compounded threats, right? It's not just climate change. And so thinking about how we collectively build that voice where through different medium, through the arts, through music, through song, and through science. Because I think we spoke about this too, that even science has an element of creativity. And you go back and you think about some of the fundamental science when it came back, if you go back to natural history, it was all observation based. And because of the pace, I think, at which humanity forces us along in our societies, we've lost that. That it goes back to being in touch with nature. And I think that, and losing touch with ourselves. And that's where I would, I'm starting to hopefully find my voice and convince other scientists to find their voice outside of the objectivity of their science, to speak up. And I think we need that. Otherwise, it's just going to be kind of too late. So.
Yeah, I think this is the challenge for academics, for scientists, for writers as well. I do remember thinking of natural history, an early version from Pliny about explaining why the bee flew as the bee flew, and it was because he had a little stone on his back. That was the observation that Pliny had made about bees, and somehow that image has always stayed with me as a kind of marvelously inventive rendition of what was observed, not scientifically based, but nonetheless indelible. Yeah. Yes, Selena.
Yes, I just had a thought. I thought, because we as a human in this time of age, we laud ourselves for being forward thinking and progressive thinking. Yet when it comes to something that is not familiar with familiar with us, we do not accept it. And so that then just makes me think that there's a lot of superiority complex that is there, and lots of communication, miscommunication that is being happening, and the lack of respect for what is different than what you are brought up with. And so adding on to your point on communicating and localizing the language that you have, because we can speak like this. I work with my other youth climate activists, the climate scientists, writers, and whatnot, and the language we use is very different. Yet when I go back home and speak with my people, they are completely, though they are part of the crisis and live through it, they're completely removed from this world. And so how I communicate with them is very different. And so just to give an example, we are an extremely religious country. We are very Christian. And when I speak with my elders about the science and the climate change, they say, oh, we're not going to accept your reasons because science denies God. And so I have to go and talk to them and say, oh, but when God created the Garden of Eden, why did he put Adam and Eve to it? And then their answer is, oh, to protect it and to take care of it. And so then we say, well, then he's putting us here on earth to do what for the earth? Then their answer is to protect and take care of it. So that's how we then communicate and talk with them and speak in their tongue, because it's a matter of respecting their perspectives and their upbringing, but also meeting them where they are at rather than demanding that they meet us where we are at. So.
Right. Yeah, that's great. So rather than issue a correction, right, you're moving through their perspective. Yeah, that's really lovely. I'm going to move on to the next question. This is a writer and activist, Naomi Klein, who claims, in the rocky future, we have already made inevitable an unshakable belief in the equal rights of all people, and a capacity for deep empathy will be the only thing standing between humanity and barbarism. In what ways do empathy and a belief in equity inform your work? Drawing from a global perspective on environmental degradation and climate instability, what frightens you most and what makes you most hopeful? Can we start with you, Bao, if that's all right?
Can I share with what makes me hopeful first?
You can answer any, you don't feel like I was like pretending to be one question. It's really 7, so just pick one.
Often, it has been a very difficult journey when Tim and we quit our jobs after hearing the 5th IPCC report. That was back in 2015. It has been a very difficult 7 years running this project, and even touring the US right now. It's a very difficult time. But every time when I think back 7 years ago, Tim and we just quit our jobs, and we took a picture of us standing on the Sturt Highway. It's the only one sort of bitumen road from the top of Australia to the south of Australia. And that time we only had about $5,000 Australian dollars between us, and we have this dream of doing Swan Big Song project, crossing the ocean, recording and filming. And we have each other, and now when we're on tour, we have a bus full of people. We're all like-minded people sharing the same dream. And I think that's the power of unity. And it's important, more and more when I think about it, it is important when you have an idea, draw a circle as big as you can, so there's a lot of space for other people to step in. And that has been carrying, that sentence has been carrying me through a lot of the hardships we experience. But every time when we share this space like this, makes me hopeful.
Right.
Yeah, thank you.
I love that, yeah, finding like-minded people, yeah, and kind of shedding that sense of isolation that can be so distressing. So it is a multi-part question. It's empathy and equity, hope and despair.
Well, I can just say that was beautiful. I love that notion of, leaving room for other people to come in. And so that's very hopeful, that possibility of being joined in the mission, right? And if I think about hope, I think about the awareness of the youth and how the youth are stepping up and leading, the older population in recognizing the conditions and, being willing to make change and so forth. So that's my feeling where the hope comes from. The thing that I'm most afraid of, I think, that was another part of that question, is that the Western society has been modeling the wrong things, and that people in other parts of the world have been looking at these pathways as what they aspire to, right? And so, for example, I don't remember how many years ago, but I was a part of a program in Indonesia. And we traveled in different places. And in one moment, we were visiting a university and having lunch with dignitaries, et cetera. And so our lunch was a paper plate on which a cardboard box was placed, and you opened the cardboard box, and there were cellophane and plastic wrappers and plastic silverware, and it was this Western model of efficiency, right, and that kind of thing. And then later in that same week, we were having a meal with some Indigenous people who served the meal on a banana leaf, and everything. So I worry that what is being upheld as prosperity or, success are the wrong things. And that's my biggest fear.
Right, so the confusion of prosperity and disposability, right? And so we think the faster we can use it up and throw it away, the more successful an exchange it's been, yeah. Selena, how about you?
Yes, on deep empathy. Maybe it's the cynical side of me, but I don't even know if that's possible for everybody to achieve. Because, we're all very different. We don't all wear the same shoe size. So all of our experiences are completely different from each other. I can get punched in the face and you can get punched in the neck, and I tell you, I understand how you feel. And empathy means to be able to put yourself in someone else's shoe, which is not always the case for everybody. And so I think all of it really just comes down to respect and understanding that, and also just being mindful that not everything is about you. And even if you don't understand where that person is coming from, you just have to accept that that is their side of the story and respect it, and then see how you can maneuver around that to make sure they're accommodated, their needs are being taken care of and respected. And so I don't know if empathy would be the way to go, but definitely respect and acceptance, even if you don't understand at all, because again, you're not me, I'm not you. Yeah, and on fear, what I'm most afraid of, I think I'm really just afraid of us humans. And myself, growing up and seeing the ocean and seeing the water just rising and always flooding our homes, I always thought, that's what I'm so scared of. And now I just feel such great shame to think that, why did I think I have to be afraid of the ocean? Because ocean is just responding to the injustice that is being put onto it, and the people who are the ones who are delivering this injustice onto the ocean and nature is us humans. So it should never have been nature that I was afraid of. It should have been us humans, and I wish that we could be better.
Right. Yeah. We're in an era when we're influencing everything, right? The human influences on everything. Andy.
I just have one thing that I think fears me is that it's more like, how do we, it's not only convince, maybe it's not the right word, but raise an awareness that in the westernized pavement worlds of big cities, where we could work with people to be more introspective and lead an examined life in terms of the way that what their footprint is having on the environment in their daily lives. And I think that, and I say this all sort of tongue in cheek where, and there's generational hurdles that we have to go through. There's contextual hurdles that we have to go through in terms of understanding where our plastics come from, what waste is, how we think about, international travel and globalization. And I mean, think about, one thing that happened, a positive thing related to the pandemic, if there's anything positive related to the pandemic, were those times where cars were at a standstill and we weren't flying around in planes and smog cleared up around some major cities. And we think about how we were kind of forced to make a drastic change, and we saw things clear up, right? But when we're not forced to make a drastic change and people aren't, we're asking them to voluntarily make behavioral changes about how they, what they do with their waste, or what kind of vehicles they buy, or what, how they, what they're teaching to their kids, and the morals and values that are transcended from generation to generation. I think that what fears me is that we're not making those changes from generation to generation fast enough. And we're not promoting the fact that each person can make a difference, right? And I do this a lot when I talk about recreational fisheries, and how every time you interact with a fish, you have the capacity to practice conservation with each fish, how you're going to either harvest it or handle it and release it. Well, the same thing is true about individual decisions that can lead to positive collective action. We're kind of stuck where, when it goes back to this idea of what is success and what is forward. And we talked about this earlier too, where it's like, well, if you keep thinking about going forward, but your next step is off the edge of a cliff, then maybe backwards, or changing direction or changing course away from the edge of the cliff is the way to go. But then what's needed to make that course correction? And it ties back into this idea of finding a way to catalyze a greater movement. We're seeing it with younger generation, but we also have to get the older generations to wake up and to buy in. And we saw that with like the recycling movement in the 80s and things like that. I remember poking my parents about like, oh yeah, the thing, it's called a blue box, and what am I supposed to do with that? I'm supposed to recycle in that. I think the fear that I have is trying to make those changes faster, to catch up with the rising temperatures and the rising sea levels and everything else that's happening in terms of ocean acidification and all these things that are accelerating at a pace that doesn't necessarily seem to match the willingness of human societies to also match that pace and do more. And I think it goes back to the, I think, Selena, when you were on stage yesterday and you were talking about, 1.5 is not enough, right? And it's a compromise. We can't compromise anymore. Yet there's a lot of people in our society that this conversation doesn't even enter their sphere of reality, because it's not the first thing, on Fox News or CNN or, there's other things, and climate and the environment gets pushed down until there's something catastrophic like a fire or a flood. And it has to be more commonplace, and we need to find ways to catalyze things at a much faster pace.
Right, and I think even people who are really engaged with it sometimes think that I had a writing teacher who said, and is truer than but. So rather than worry or squabble about what is the best approach, is it the individual capacity of individuals to change, or do we really have to have global climate leadership? It's not either or, right? We have to, all of us, do everything, right? Kimberly, were you going to, sorry.
I was just going to say one small thing, which is also we cannot have political leaders who forbid us to use the language of climate change.
Right.
That's all. That's what I want to say.
This was Scott Pruitt's first thing, right? He's got to get that word, that little couple of words out of there, out of all the EPA materials. Yes. Yeah. I'm going to move back to a kind of more maybe artsy question, if that's okay with everybody. This is a question about beauty, which is one of those, as you say, kind of ineffable things that's hard to talk about. But disaster and war have a way of reducing what is beautiful to rubble. What to you is beautiful? And might a shared reverence for beauty inhibit or catalyze our response to the climate perils we face? Could you start us off with that one?
Wow. Yeah, well, very much I do see myself as an artist, although I'm a producer and a curator in a sense, that we work with other artists to create the work. But with the film that we made, we very much wanted to focus on the beauty, because I do see a lot of art does challenge, and it is that tension in the art. It's the contradictions, the tension between the beauty and the tragedy and everything. But also, I think at times just appreciating the beauty in things and the spirit that comes through, and that does get lost in, that's important too. So with the film, we really wanted to, like with artists, go into nature to film like the things that are celebrating and uplifting, the things they love, and through their direction. And we very much focused on that. And in the course of that, we did see sea level rise and coral bleaching, and there are songs that go to those spaces there as well. But I sort of tried to keep my voice out of the film, and to let the places we chose to go film, the nature, dictate the narrative of the film, which is why also our film doesn't have any narration to it. It doesn't have any voiceovers. It doesn't have any interviews. It's all about like another form of narratives, the songs, which is more a narrative form from that region to create the form of it. Yeah, I don't know if that answers it, but beauty very much was in the forefront of what we were doing.
Absolutely, the visual and heard beauty. Yeah. I thought too, Andy, of what you said about the wonder of fish. It's also utility. You put them on their plate, you put them on the end of your hook, but it's also just like you look at them, you listen, you see what's happening, and that's a kind of reverence. Yeah. Do other folks want to speak to that question?
Yes. So I am on a journey of self-love and learning how to care for oneself. And so Sammy, who's one of our other musicians, he sort of adopted me as his daughter, and he calls me his flower. And that makes me feel really beautiful. And so I find myself beautiful for all the work that I've done and for continuing to be resilient and a human being on this planet.
I love it. Great. Self-love. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think we maybe should move on to the next question in this, but I don't want to skip over. I really love that question, but I also recognize it's a little hard to answer. Yeah, Andy.
I have a thought on that in terms of the places that I've thought of as beautiful are not the places that are paved, and the places that and a lot of it goes back to the things that I was introduced to when I was a kid. And the fond memories that I had. I grew up in a blue-collar family in like outskirts of Toronto, like cold, snow, and I came along later in my parents' life, and had the opportunity to go to Andros Island in the Bahamas when I was like 5. And my dad, and that even getting there, that was in the 70s. And getting there, it was an adventure. It was fairly remote. And I remember my dad putting a mask on my face and like basically shoving me in the water when I was 5, right? And I was just like, oh, like sharks and barracuda and seagrass and that point of reference, that immersive experience in what was then in the Bahamas was fairly intact ecosystem and very beautiful. And that really was, it influenced so my reference point, and also my career and the things that, you know, even though I didn't grow up on a small island and I didn't grow up, you know, I'm not Bahamian, but I was able to appreciate the connection at an early age between the nature and the culture and the people that were reliant on the healthy ecosystems. And, you know, and then I, you know, head back to Southern Ontario at a time where we were polluting the Great Lakes, and, you know, moving on in my undergraduate career and learning about how we're just effing up the ecosystems, and still being able to escape away from the Great Lakes to go up into the wilderness, and to understand that, you know, the beauty of a pristine environment. And I think that I'm worried, and you know, in sort of the science speak, we call this idea about shifting baselines, right? And a phase shift about, you know, if you put somebody in, you know, from that's never seen a coral reef before, and you put them in an environment where, you know, there's 80% coral loss and there's still some fish swimming around, they'll perceive that as the most beautiful thing they've ever seen in their lives. And so, but in terms of, and that's great, and if that can be inspirational, that's amazing, but we have to also make the point that that is a degraded ecosystem. That, you know, even though that they might see that as beautiful, can you imagine what it was like when there's 80% coral cover or 90% coral cover and things were more intact? How can we encourage them to see that even though what they perceive as beauty right now, there's a lot more beauty there before, and we have to find ways to get back there. And there are still places on this planet that are that beautiful and pristine. I was fortunate enough to develop a research project in the Seychelles, and on a small atoll. And you know, I've been fortunate enough to see lots of other coral reef ecosystems and be around in the Caribbean and other places in the South Pacific. And it was the pioneering trip where I was developing relationships with the local community and local NGOs and government officials. And I remember putting my face in the water, and I came out and I was crying. You know, and I'm actually like almost crying now because of because it was so remote, right? That the coral reef, there was 90% coral cover, the fish was abundant, and I was reminded then at that point that there are places like that still on our planet that exist. Even though over the past how many decades that I've been studying and being a scientist, and what we're exposed to is these calamities, that things are degrading and things are sliding. You know, we're beating up our environment really badly. That there's still these areas of hope, right? That there's still these areas where we haven't quite, the weight of humanity isn't quite there yet. Even though plastics are washing up on the beach in these pristine areas, there's still some hope in terms of what's there, and that ties back into that beauty in terms of how do we translate what a purely pristine environment looks like, and how do we go, where do we need to get back to really think about how we encourage the next generation and the current generation to raise the bar in terms of the amount that we're going to pressure, you know, politicians, governments, captains of industry, that without that sort of appreciation for beauty, that we're not going to have the momentum we need to create that positive change, and whether it's climate change or pollution or other things.
Yeah.
It was a long, convoluted story, but bringing it back to those personal experiences and what we define as beauty, and thinking about how we allow people to recognize that there's beauty that still exists, and there is hope, right?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Go ahead.
It reminds me, there's a song in our album called Hiroa. It was written by Beitiani from Tahiti. And when we were talking on Zoom, she was talking about she wants to write a song about the memory she had with her father when she was growing up. They would see so many different colors underwater and coral reefs, but now they don't appear anymore. And I remember receiving the song and thinking about the power of storytelling and songwriting. And I think, like us, we're not scientists, but everyone has a role to play in whatever agency you have and the role you can play. And Selena actually has been very inspiring for us, because when you did that closing plenary at COP21 for Paris Agreement, it was a storytelling format that really inspired a lot of decision makers. And us as artists, I think we do have the way to speak to people's hearts rather than the numbers and things in people's head. And I just want to, add that.
Yeah, I really agree, and that's a kind of segregation of mind and body as a project of civilization, and the segregation. Because some of what you were saying, Andy, sounded like spiritual work, right? And we have to remember that these are all bound together. I think I'm going to skip my last question, which has a lot to do with resistance and revolt and public protest, and open up the questions to the audience, because I don't want to neglect you out there just because it's in the dark. To wonder if there are questions you all would like to ask our panelists.
Just raise your hand if you have a question.
There you go.
Thank you so much. Hello? Oh gosh. So I'm a student here, obviously, and I'm engaging with a lot of these things, and I'm relatively new to just so much information that is incredibly hard to process, and I'm engaging with this stuff, and I wonder, you're all, I look up to you very highly, and you have a lot of educational experience, and I wonder how much of your knowledge base and your spark or finding your role that you choosing to play, because there's so many directions you could go in. It's very, I mean, the word I always come back to is overwhelming. We know that this is a common emotion and experience. So I wonder how much knowledge did you gain from your time in school versus when you actually went out into the world and started exploring and engaging? What I don't know, where, yeah, take that whatever direction you choose to.
I would just say, I find this issue, and you framed it at the start, overwhelming and debilitating, crushing. But it's through, I mean, really just through the agency. It was not a big thing that we had to work with music and artists that was actually gave momentum to be able to live, to act, to feel, have my feet on the earth and a personality, engage with people and not just withdraw because of the weight of it. Through Babo, through the artists we met, through creating a concert, we can support each other, in that space. And we hope too that the song you mentioned with Vaitini, Hiroa, and many of the songs on our album, that we do go to some places of, sadness that actually we're supporting each other in that space by recognizing that reality, and there's sort of strength and there's movement in that as well. So that's where that feeling leads to action and momentum and enabling, to exist and have hope, because hope is a panacea without action, really.
Right, yeah, that kind of antidote to despair, right? I will let other folks answer this, but I also think it's good to remember that education, college education is just a beginning, It's like, I know everything I know about climate, I learned not in school. I learned it from books and from my people I talked to and people who are doing deep research. And it's not overwhelming, yes. I like what the poet says. He says, let it be small enough and you pick your thing. You pick your tree, you pick whatever it is in you, and you find your voice in it.
Yeah. When I was in university, I studied business management. And I remember I wasn't really good at school. And more I studied, more confused I got because I wasn't into conventional money-making business. But when we started Small Island Big Song, one point I suddenly realized, wow, that's what I was studying. Studying how to manage a business, but where you want to put it is your decision. But the knowledge will follow you, and one day it will become useful. Yeah. So it is from school, but it is not. It's the both.
Yeah, it's retroactive too, right? Yeah. Did you want to say something more? Okay.
I just want to say this role that I'm playing, that I'm in right now, it's not something that I chose for myself. It just landed on me. I think I can't choose because of where I'm from, the experiences that I grew up with. And so there's a lot of resentment that also comes with having to play this role as well. And it's something that I grapple with daily, hence self-love journey and trying to do a lot of self-care. And also growing up, I was a person who really liked going to school just because I loved learning, and it was because of circumstances in my past, it was an escape for me, school. And so I think similar to Baba, it's very theory based. A lot of the stuff you learn when you go out into the real world, it's like all practical. So you're basically applying those to your real life situation and also coming to learn more. But I think right now with the media, internet, there's so much knowledge that is accessible in so many ways. And so I think knowledge itself doesn't have to just stick inside the school. You don't have to formally learn it there. You can always just browse Google or go out into your environment in nature and build your community as well as you're trying to learn and move forward. And having that community itself will be really one of the backbones for you to continue progressing in this path.
There's a pretty good list of resources too at the back of your program if you know how to work a QR code. I don't, but yeah, some good reading there. Other questions from the audience?
I just thought of a question for the musicians in particular. I was wondering if you've come into a mode where you're performing for other audiences and traveling, or whether you might also continue to connect with other musicians in the places you travel to, and in the way that the project began, it could also continue and connect with people in this country, the one that does the most damage, finding musicians here, because to some extent the universal condition on the planet these days is migration, and migration from country to city, and the beauty and the loss that comes with that. And I can't think of any kind of music that doesn't, in some sense, contain that. And certainly yours does. Yeah.
If just quickly answer that from the producer point of view, yeah, it's we're very aware that we're bringing the artists, we're bringing our stories, which represent a different part of the world, to these places, and as we're acknowledging the Indigenous cultural lineage through our stories, we have been reaching out to the traditional owners of different places where we've been going, and which has been picked up in different ways, and so we've been making our stage available for those voices as well, which it happens in some places, others not. And we've also been making our stage open for youth voices, so intergenerational voices on our stage. So we have had some of those interactions. Miami was amazing. We had 5 artists representing, for us, the Atlantic Ocean, the Caribbean, from 5 different islands, and we performed, and everyone wrote and performed together. And for us, it was like uniting the world's great oceans, you know, the island voices. Yeah.
We have a question coming in too from our faraway audience. The question is, how do we balance the idea of showing humanity untouched environments, such as you were talking about, Andy, without risking further degradation by humanity wanting to fly and visit these remote places?
Okay, I did have a thought about this that I was part of when we think about beauty, right? I think it's important for us to see the beauty that's before us, wherever we are, right? And I, as a poet, I'm often saying that what we need to do is to re-see, to see and then to see deeper, to look closer at what's before us, because it doesn't matter where we are. There are incredible transformational moments waiting for us to just communicate with them, to notice. And so, like, I am engaged in a series of poems called The Way We Love Something Small, which are just centering on that. So I worry when we present to people this idea that there are pristine places to which where they could find this impeccable beauty, when in fact there are very few places that are not touched by the degradation that we've caused. And so it's important for us to learn to love nature, the world, wherever we are, because we will not work to change what's happening if we don't already feel and love and therefore invest in protection. So I think that as artists, that is part of our role, is to invite people in to their own spaces, right? So whatever we create is not closed. Like, I think the world is not a surface. There are depths, right? And so what we need to do is to invite people into those depths where they already stand, sit, lay, swim. And that's the invitation of art, is to yourself enter the experience. Paula Gunn-Allen said art should not talk about experience, it should be experience. That we need to experience. And I think that is a challenge. That is a challenge, but I believe that, you know, that's an aesthetic that we can strive for in artistic works, to leave a space, to invite and to leave a space for our readers, listeners, whatever, to make together an art that is about the beauty. And I mean, this is something I could talk about endlessly, so I'll just leave that. But I really want to emphasize the idea that the world is not surface. And art isn't a thing we put on the wall. It's a process. And that we are all always engaged in that process of experiencing and making beauty, that we are makers, we're not consumers, right?
Absolutely. No, and beautiful. That was a beautiful answer. And I think what I think about you, I mean, as a poet, you help us to receive by renaming. And there was a point in a poem or something you had said about, I think it's the sandhill crane, right? And the name that your people have for that bird is the echo maker. And I think I will never hear a sandhill crane in quite the same way again. I will listen for the echo that you've spoken of. And so some of it is in the language, right? Our reverence is embedded in the language and in the remaking of the language. I appreciate that very much. I think there's a big clock over there that says we should close things up. But I wanted to give you, if there's something you really wanted to say here at the last, and to share with our audience, that you had a chance here at the end to say that. We've had a good conversation, so lots of riches have arisen, and I appreciate all of you being here and all of the virtual audience. And thanks again, Darcy, Kurt of the School of Earth and Sustainability, to all the good people here and sponsors. It's really a challenge, I think, to speak across disciplines in this way. I think that feeling that none of us is expert, that we have to give ourselves permission to come out here and maybe move into some other kinds of language, some other ways of talking. So thank you for being here. Thanks to all of our panelists and for all people who helped put this together. Fine Arts Center, MFA, Jennifer Jacobson sitting in the back. All this is a lot of the workhorse effort of making all this happen. Hilary Rothbun, Michael Sakamoto, thanks to all of you. Take care.